The avoidant never expected finality. They built their entire relational framework on the assumption that distance was always reversible, that doors they walked through could be reopened at their convenience, that their absence would create longing rather than liberation. They operated with the confidence of someone who believed they were irreplaceable, that no matter how much they withdrew, someone would always be there waiting for their return. But then something shifted. The person they took for granted finally chose themselves. The door closed, the access ended, and the avoidant, who convinced themselves they preferred solitude, discovered that being truly cut off triggers a devastation they never prepared for. Subscribe if you need to understand why walking away affects them more than all the chasing ever did. Clarity like this changes everything. The shattering of assumed permanence. The avoidant's confidence in their own desirability depends on the fantasy that they are always wanted, always accessible, always an option, even when they refuse to commit. Being cut off destroys this fantasy with brutal efficiency. There is no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no possibility of return. The person who once pursued has stopped completely. The person who once tolerated their inconsistency has established a boundary that cannot be negotiated. This creates a psychological crisis for the avoidant because it confronts them with a reality they spent years avoiding. They were not as valuable as they believed. Their presence was not as essential as they assumed, and their strategy of maintaining control through distance has resulted in permanent loss. The devastation is not just about losing a person, it is about losing the narrative that protected their ego. They must now face that they drove away someone who genuinely cared, that their behavior had consequences they cannot undo, that their assumption of infinite chances was a delusion that served only to enable their dysfunction. The confrontation with unprocessed need. What devastates the avoidant most profoundly is the forced recognition of how much they actually needed what they pretended not to want. When someone cuts them off completely, there is no longer any buffer between the avoidant and their own emotional reality. They cannot rely on sporadic contact to regulate their attachment system. They cannot use occasional interactions to confirm they are still relevant. They cannot maintain the illusion of connection without the responsibility of actually connecting. The complete absence forces them to feel the depth of what they lost. And this feeling is unbearable. They realize too late that the person they dismissed provided something irreplaceable. Unconditional presence that accepted them despite their flaws, patience that tolerated their push and pull, consistency that remained even when they offered nothing in return. The avoidant took this for granted, assuming it would always be available, never considering that tolerance has limits and patience eventually expires. Now sitting in the silence of being truly cut off, they must confront the dependency they denied. The attachment they suppressed, the need they spent years convincing themselves they did not have, the regret that cannot be remedied. The devastation reaches its peak when the avoidant realizes that regret is useless without access. They can finally see their patterns clearly. They can recognize the damage they caused. They can understand what they destroyed and why it mattered. But none of this insight grants them the opportunity to repair what they broke. Being cut off means that their realization comes too late, that their growth is irrelevant to someone who has moved beyond waiting for it. This is perhaps the most painful lesson the avoidant ever learns. That people do not wait forever, that second chances are not infinite, that there is a point of no return where all the understanding in the world cannot undo the harm that was done. The devastation is complete because it is irreversible. They must live with the knowledge that they had something real, and they destroyed it through their own fear, their own avoidance, their own inability to choose vulnerability over safety. And now, cut off completely, They exist in a state of permanent loss, haunted by the ghost of what could have been if only they had been capable of showing up before it was too late.